Thank you for joining us. This is an Infowars.com special report on August 30th, 2011. We've got several guests joining us coming up, but first, the news. Well, next stop for NATO. They're announcing that indeed they've been financing the rebels in Syria, just like they financed the rebels in Libya. And there's talk of blockades, embargoes, and perhaps even air bombardments of the nation of Syria. On top of that, Congressman Ron Paul has come out and said, look, you've already caused a giant quagmire in Libya. No doubt that Muammar Gaddafi was an unsavory character, but now you're simply creating a power vacuum that brings in even more dangerous elements. Quote, Gaddafi may well have been a tyrant, but as such, he was no worse than many others that we support and count as allies. We see a pattern of relatively secular leaders in the Arab world being targeted for regime change, with the resulting power vacuum being filled by much more radical elements. And that's what we'll be talking to Pepe Escobar, writer for Asia Times, who's been in the Middle East and North Africa. And he's got the article out, How Al-Qaeda Got to Rule Tripoli. Again, that is coming up, a in-depth look at that situation. Also, negative view of federal government hits new high. The federal government is at an all-time historical low with credibility with the American people. And why is that happening? Well, you've got the federal government pushing the states, and also in D.C. raiding people that are having lemonade stands. You have young children being fined, or even adults being arrested. We have federal regulations coming into force that seek to restrict people having gardens in their own yards. And Gibson Guitars has now been raided, and we've now learned it wasn't over illegal foreign wood. It was over, quote, labor practices, because under UN Agenda 21 international law, you can't import wood and then work the wood or make any changes to it. Continuing with other reasons that the federal government is so incredibly unpopular, we have an article at Infowars.com today that quotes Coin World, as well as the U.S. Secret Service and Department of Justice. And in that report, feds may seize Liberty dollars. And they go on in the report to say that the owner, who is awaiting sentencing after his conviction, is a, quote, unique type of terrorist because they seek to undermine our democratic form of government, when it's the Federal Reserve that in actuality has been doing that all along. And the Secret Service, this is the big new development here, is saying that they may raid people that actually own silver and gold coins that they got from the Liberty Dollar. An incredible new development on that front. Continuing with news, yesterday we interviewed Mike Adams of Natural News, the health ranger, and he compiled an extensive report. Natural News exposes secret vaccine industry ties and military involvement with Institute of Medicine, reveals fatal conflicts of interest. And we've now learned that the Institute of Medicine claims they're not federally funded, but 64% of their funding comes from the federal government. But the private funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others. And don't forget who else. That's right, McDonald's. So we weren't surprised today when we received and made phone calls and confirmed that all over North Texas and Dallas and Fort Worth, when you get the little paper sheet that is in the bottom of the McDonald's tray with your hamburger and cheeseburger, it's got all these messages about how important it is to vaccinate. And where it says immunize means healthy lives, little heart over the I, so you know it's good for you. And Rick Perry, the presidential candidate, of course, here in Texas, engaged in a mass criminal hoax and told the world it was the law to take the deadly Gardasil vaccine that had killed people in trials. So this is par for the course for the state of Texas. But remember, McDonald's did not tell anybody that they're part of this pro-vaccine propaganda arm, the Institute of Medicine. Well, that's it for the news brief here at the start of the transmission. We're going to come back from break and go to a reporter from the Asia Times, Pepe Escobar, who has lived all over the world, interviewed the heads of the Northern Alliance and many others, and who has the inside scoop on Al-Qaeda being handed control of Libya by NATO and the U.S. government. Please stay with us. It's Infowars.com special report.
You don't need me to tell you that humanity is in a deep crisis. Everyone can feel it. We know a tectonic struggle is now taking place between the forces of freedom and those who love darkness, bondage, and enslavement. Yes, my friends, evil is rising. But take heart. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Recently, New World Order operative Hillary Clinton admitted they're losing the info war.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war.
The globalists are scared. They've overreached. The future of the info war is in your hands. Join PrisonPlanet.tv. Download the thousands of special video reports, ebooks, and more, and get them out to everyone you know. Continue to spread the word about the broadcast on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and every other globalist propaganda platform. We are going to use their system against them. The info war now goes into high gear.
We are back. You're watching an Infowars.com special report. We're about to interview a very interesting gentleman. He's a journalist. He's an author. He's also an extreme traveler. He interviewed the head of the Northern Alliance just weeks before he was killed. He was inside Afghanistan right before 9/11. He is journalist Pepe Escobar, and his book, Globalism, How the Globalized World is Dissolving into Liquid War, is an absolute must-read. Pepe, thank you so much for joining us.
Great talking to you, Alex.
Well, you have been reporting for Asia Times that Al-Qaeda has taken over Tripoli and is being handed the nation. The LA Times even admits that the leaders of most of the rebellion are actual jihadi Al-Qaeda fighters. What can you tell us from your decade-plus research?
Look, I had to confirm, a lot of us came to this information different ways, of course. The LA Times, for instance, The Independent in London, Al-Sharq al-Wasat in the Middle East, and myself, but we got to the same conclusion. The top military guys in Tripoli, in the southwest mountains, southwest of Tripoli, and in Cyrenaica, in Benghazi and Derna, they are all Al-Qaeda linked. This means they were and they are still part of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, LIFG. This is a jihadi organization founded in the 90s to fight against Gaddafi, basically. They wanted to turn, especially Cyrenaica, eastern part of Libya, into an Islamic state and to bring down the central government in Tripoli. Obviously, Gaddafi having that absolutely hardcore intelligence service system that he had, they were fought, they had to leave the country. Many went to Afghanistan and then to Iraq. That was the case of the famous guy of the moment, Abdul Hakim Belhaj. He trained in Afghanistan in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was trained in a camp north of Kabul. Then after 9/11, he disappeared from Afghanistan. He went to Southeast Asia. He was arrested by the CIA in Malaysia in 2003. He was tortured in Bangkok in one of those extraordinary renditions, special CIA prisons all over the world. There was one in Bangkok. Then he was handed back to Libyan intelligence, Libyan security. And he stayed in Libya for the past 6 years or so. But in 2010, there was a deal between the Gaddafi government and these guys from the LIFG, especially, over 200 terrorists, let's put it this way, 214 to be exact. And they were freed after they wrote a document, more than 400 pages long, confessing their sins and saying that jihad was over. And of course, they would start, working with the Gaddafi government. So this happened March 2010, last year. After that, these guys disappeared and they surfaced in Benghazi and in Derna early this year after the first demonstrations in Cyrenaica in February this year. And some of them are now in military command posts. Some were trained by U.S. Special Forces, like the Southwestern tribe, Berber tribe contingent that went to Tripoli like 8-9 days ago and took over Tripoli. The military commander was Belhaj, and there were other LIFG guys, Al-Qaeda linked with him. But these guys, they were trained in the Southwest Mountains by U.S. Special Forces. So the U.S. knows exactly who's dealing with. And everybody, the French intelligence, British SAS, they know they're dealing with these guys. And it's you don't need a PhD in Germany to know there's going to be blowback sooner or later, Alex.
Well, certainly. Are we going to end up having a new al-Qaeda base of operations similar to Afghanistan that will then menace Europe, the Mediterranean? And is that what the military-industrial complex is looking for? Use their old ally from the Russian war now against Gaddafi, and then later, a few years down the road, oh, there has to be a new invasion, fresh meat for the war machine to deal with al-Qaeda. I mean, this is just like 1984, never at war with East Asia, always at war with East Asia.
Always, exactly. No, you're right. Always a war, and this could happen within the next few weeks or months, assuming, which is practically certain, that this hardcore Islamists cannot be part of a transitional government in Libya, or the next government for that matter. In fact, Belhaj last week, 1 week ago, last Tuesday, he said on the record that he wants Sharia law for Libya. Can you imagine? So Gaddafi, okay, hardcore, old world, Cold War style dictator. We all know that. But he's a very clever guy as well. From the beginning, he was saying this was an Al-Qaeda linked and foreign-based intervention.
Well, we know.
And he was absolutely right, because his intelligence services dealt with these guys on a daily basis, and they were imprisoned by the regime.
Well, that was my next question, because you've been studying this for more than a decade. I remember back in '96, it later came out in the BBC, that the West had tried to use al-Qaeda to kill Gaddafi because Gaddafi was the first person to put an Interpol warrant out for Osama bin Laden. And it turns out now that from the beginning, the rebels were financed by the West, by NATO, by the U.S. And so what's the end game here? Is there anything legitimate about this revolution in Libya? Or was it what it appears to be, the West starting this from the beginning and using al-Qaeda fighters to start this?
Yes, it's true. There was a legitimate component of the so-called uprising. This is a movement called February 17th movement. A lot of young people, unemployed people, some with good diplomas, by the way, the Google generation living in eastern Libya, they were trying to rise against the regime again. And they had some legitimate demonstrations in early February, mid-February in Benghazi. But then these demonstrations were hijacked by this compound, this motley crew of Gaddafi defectors, Al-Qaeda Islamists, British Special Forces, the French intelligence, everybody. This was one of the openings. But it was not an opening itself, because the war, or the military coup d'etat, if we can put it this way, was concocted last year, and guess where? In France. The whole thing started in October 2010. Gaddafi's chief of protocol, a guy called Nouri Mesmari, he defected, he went to Paris, he was approached by French intelligence, he said he was in contact with hardcore military personnel, especially in Benghazi, but he also had contacts in Tripoli with possible defectors. They started to organize what will be a military coup, and they said, look, we need a popular component for all this. The popular component was the February 17th movement, because they start to be instigated by a number of sources. Okay, let's start planning demonstrations for February. So when the demonstrations happened, and in the beginning they were legitimate by these young guys, basically, they were immediately hijacked by the motley crew. And then we could see the French agenda at play.